This next group of colonies we're going to talk about are called the Restoration Colonies. And these colonies are going to pick up after the English Civil War. The English Civil War will throw England into turmoil, obviously, for about 40 years, and will stop any new colonies from getting a charter. Let me explain the English Civil War real quick. James I, who I talked about and when I talked about chapter 1, will, along with his brother who comes to the throne after him, Charles I, will spend England into bankruptcy. And Parliament does not like James and Charles. They don't get along. They don't respect Parliament's authority. And by 1640, Charles is so broke, he's forced to call Parliament into session and ask them to raise taxes so the kingdom can have more money. Parliament refuses to do this both times and begins passing laws trying to limit the power of the king, so he dismisses Parliament. Parliament is the Congress of England. In 1642, Parliament raises an army to fight against the king. This is the English Civil War from 1642 to 1651. The Cavaliers, supporters of the king, versus the Roundheads, supporters of Parliament. The Parliament is Puritan. The king is Anglican. Henry VIII's whole thing, where the new English church is basically the Catholic Church, but just the leader is the king and not the Pope, that's Anglicanism. The Puritans want a true Protestant church. They want to get rid of all the Catholic elements of the church. Anyway, they win this war, and in 1649, they cut Charles's head off. And that's really important. We'll talk about that a lot in class. In 1658, the leader of the parliamentary forces, the Roundheads, Oliver Cromwell, dies, and his son is put in power but unable to keep control. And in 1660, English supporters of the king will bring Charles's son back from exile in France to England and put him on the throne. And this is called the Restoration. They've restored the monarchy. Charles II will then, and this is why it's important to us in U.S. history, will start rewarding people who supported them by giving away land in America to those who were loyal to him. Now, is it his land to give away? No, it's really the Native Americans' land, right? That doesn't stop him. He gives it away anyway. The Carolinas, New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania, as well as Delaware, will all come out of this granting of land by Charles II. And that's why they're called the Restoration Colonies, because they come after the restoration of the king. So there they are. You can see these here in this beige color. These are going to be the colonies we're talking about here. As we know, Plymouth is already there with all this other stuff. We've already talked about that. And we've already touched on Virginia and Maryland. We'll get to Georgia later. All right. Carolina. 8 supporters of the king were given as a group their own kind of kingly authority over the area from Virginia to Florida. They gave themselves enormous estates. They established a headright system. Remember, that's where if you bring people over, you get more land. They're trying to get population over there. They gave the people of Carolina a representative assembly, and all Christian faiths were allowed, so they had some degree of freedom. But few came, and there wasn't much profit made. Most of the original owners of Carolina, the guys who it was given to, gave up their land, considering the thing a bust. But one of the owners, Anthony Ashley Cooper, refused to give up, and he would spend decades trying to turn this thing into a profitable venture. Eventually, in 1670, he'll finance 300 settlers. He'll pay their way to come to the Carolinas, but only 100 will make it. 200 will die along the way. I believe a couple of the ships wrecked. They will establish Port Royal, which is today called Charlestown, South Carolina. Carolina, by the way, means Charles. It's a variation of Charles. And, of course, Charlestown. So these are named after Charles II, the guy who gave them the land. Anthony Ashley Cooper will also hire John Locke to write a constitution for Carolina. Now, John Locke we'll talk a lot more about later, but he's the guy who invented the entire idea of government that America will be founded on, and the British government by now is founded on. He's one of the most important philosophers who ever lived. Locke's constitution establishes a class system, so there are official classes. So there's the aristocracy, and then there's working people, and then there's slaves, and you're given those ranks by the government. It does have representative government based on land holdings, not people. So if you own a lot of land, you have more say in the government than if you own no land. The two parts of Carolina, the north and the south, develop completely differently. North Carolina tends to be poor. It doesn't have very good coastline. Its land isn't as good for crops, where South Carolina begins to become a pretty significant success. There's a lot of tension between the groups, the poor in the north and the rich in the south, and so eventually South Carolina is split into what we know of today, North and South Carolina. The South Carolina economy, by the way, is based on rice cultivation at this time. South Carolina is also the colony with the closest ties to Barbados, which is an island over there in the Caribbean. And most immigrants to the Carolinas actually come from the Caribbean, not from England. And they bring with them their slaves, and this is why South Carolina becomes one of the most slave-intensive states in the whole country, more so even than places like Virginia. I'm not done with Carolina. In 1719, northern farmers seized control from the aristocrats, and it'll be 10 years later, 1729, when they formally split it into two colonies. New York and New Jersey. I love this story. In 1664, Charles II gives his brother, James, the Duke of York, the Dutch colonies in America. Now, if you stop for a minute and think about this, you may wonder, who is Charles to be giving away the Dutch's land? And what he means by this is he gives James permission to go try to take the land from the Dutch, which James does. New York City is, appropriately enough, founded with a mugging. What happens is James brings the English fleet over there, parks it off the coast of Manhattan. That's the island that New York City's on. We're talking about right over here. Lands and goes up to the leader, the Dutch leader, and says, you can either give us this colony or we're going to destroy it with the fleet. Well, the Dutch are pretty defenseless. They have no way to fight off the British fleet. It's the most powerful fleet in the world. And so the Dutch leader, Peter Stuyvesant, gives what was called New Amsterdam at the time to James the Duke of York. Of course, he's James the Duke of York, so he renames it New York. So that's how New York City got started as an armed robbery. It is still one of the most cosmopolitan places on the planet, as I talked about before. It is incredibly diverse with people from all over the world. And in fact, James leaves the wealthy Dutch alone. He lets them keep their land and leaves them in power. So New York will have this kind of dual power structure where James and his followers have most of the power, but there's also these wealthy group of Dutch landowners who are still really important. It also becomes one of the fur trade capitals of the world. Europe is obsessed with things like beaver fur and deer fur and things like that. The city grows rapidly thanks to its incredibly useful natural harbor. And eventually, James will give the southern part of the colony of New York, this part here, to two of his supporters, one of whom is the Lord of Jersey back in England. And so, of course, he calls it New Jersey. Now, New Jersey is actually an economic failure. It does not have the success of New York. It's a bit of a disaster for a long time. New York, like all colonies at this time, will develop an east-west tension where the wealthier landowners are all along the coast and the backwoods is filled up with poor backwoodsmen. The final Restoration colony we're going to talk about is Pennsylvania. Now, before we get into Pennsylvania, we have to understand who the Quakers were. The Quakers, who actually called themselves the Society of Friends, were a mid-17th century religious movement, and they would shake as part of their religious ceremony. Actually, that's not even true. They would say that a good Christian should tremble at the name of the Lord. And so people began to make fun of them, saying they were Quakers. They were shaking with fear of God. They rejected the idea of predestination, the idea that God knew if you were going to heaven or not before you were even born. And they also rejected the idea of original sin. They did not believe that all people were filled with sin automatically. They preached about an inner light. They said that basically that we all have God inside of us, and we just have to get in touch with that. They had no formal church or clergy. They would just meet in people's houses, and whoever felt like it would stand up and speak. There was no priest or preacher. Women were allowed to speak. They had pretty much complete equality for men and women in the Quaker community. They spoke with the old-fashioned thee and thou, which gave them a very distinctive manner of speech, which of course was often mocked. They were pacifist, complete pacifists. They did not even believe in violence in the case of self-defense. They opposed all war, and they wouldn't fight for their governments, which ended up making them hated because people who were fighting the wars looked at the Quakers and said, why aren't you helping? And so that became a problem. In England, they became utterly despised and eventually began saying they needed to create a colony in the New World where Quakers could go and be left alone. Now, William Penn, this guy over here, had a very famous and important dad. His dad was a hero for Charles II. And his dad, Charles II, owed his dad a lot of money. And his dad offered to, and Charles II, offered to pay William Penn's father with a huge grant of land in the New World. William Penn's father rejected this offer, and Charles didn't have the money, so the debt went unpaid. William Penn's dad, by the way, hated William Penn because of his extreme and what we're seeing at the time kind of hippie, freaky religious views. And Penn was frequently jailed for being a Quaker. When Penn's father dies, Charles II makes the offer of the land grant to Penn, and Penn takes it so he can establish a place where the Quakers can go and be left alone. And he gets a colony called Pennsylvania, which is Penn's Wood. Penn named after the father, not the son. It turns out to be a colony filled with fertile soil and a mild climate. William Penn himself will move there and administer the colony personally and do an amazing job. He also launches an enormous ad campaign in Europe to try to talk people into coming over. And Pennsylvania was easily the most famous colony in the British colonies if you were in Europe. And it brought people from all over Europe, Germans and Dutch and Italians and French and everybody else. And if you were in Europe at the time, you probably thought the entire New World, or at least the British part, was Pennsylvania because it was so well known back in Europe. Penn also bought the land from the Native Americans, so Charles II gave it to him, but then he turned around and paid for it with the Native Americans, and he worked very hard to maintain peaceful relationships with the natives. He personally laid out the street network for the city of Philadelphia, which, by the way, means brotherly love, which is a Quaker idea. Pennsylvania will be the only colony that never has a battle with the Native Americans. Even with as nice as William Penn was, some still resented his absolute authority and went and asked him if they could be exempt from his authority. And so Penn is going to give them the southern part of Delaware, much like the southern part of New York was given away, to run on their own. And it ends up being called Delaware, after the Delaware River, which is named after that old Virginia, Jamestown governor, Delaware. Anyway, those are the Restoration Colonies. Learn all that stuff.